Hi there, I'm Christina, and welcome to my podcast. Nuance Beauty is intended to be a spot where I'll capture some varied thoughts and challenge us to hold to our opinions loosely so that we can see the beauty in others and in ourselves. I want us to dive deeper into those everyday topics or those sticky topics and thoughts that we might shy away from or bulldoze over others with our opinions. Because I think if we all thought exactly the same, there would be no need for anyone else. So let's get nuanced. Welcome back. Let's continue laying some groundwork in self-awareness by answering the question, why do we do what we do? We could probably run in 100 different directions to answer this question. But let's focus in today on this simple thought. We will always do what makes sense to us. And what makes sense to us is based on our experience or knowledge. On the one hand, we might consider this justifiably supporting our decisions and then growing more confident in the decisions that we've made with confirmation bias. On the other hand, we might consider what makes sense to someone else their blind spot because they have concluded something entirely different than what we would have. Regardless of either perception here, we can all explain why we proceeded down the course we took if we spent a moment in reflection. Some of our reasonings may be very apparent to us, while less apparent to someone else. I'd like to illustrate this point with an example that recently received a lot of attention at our house: getting the baby to sleep. Those sweet, sweet moments of holding a precious, itty bitty, sleeping baby in your arms. But did anyone ever tell you that it's truly effort in figuring out how to get these little angels to fall asleep? Maybe someone told you babies just eat and sleep and poop. But did anyone ever tell you that your baby may not know how to eat, sleep, or poop? I have two boys, and with my first son, he really struggled to lay flat in a bassinet to sleep. It seemed like he had acid reflux, and he would just spit up frequently, making it hard to settle. What worked for us was putting him to bed in a swing. Now, for those of you that just got excited because you're aware that incline sleeping has recently been viewed as risky business, thanks to the recall of Fisher Price Rock and Play, please spare me the judgment and realize that we did not have that information sitting in front of us. And to dive deeper into the uncomfortable nuance, we could rewind the clock to the babies of the 70s and 80s that went to sleep on their stomachs. That's how it was done. And today, this might cause knots in your stomach because we know better now. And we've been programmed to believe that babies falling asleep on their stomachs before they're able to roll over is very risky business that can cause SIDS. But let's get back to my son. He slept well in the swing for the first 8 months of his life. Then we moved him into the crib. The swaddle kept him cozy, and when he eventually figured out how to roll over, we transitioned him out of the swaddle and into a sleep sack. His bedtime routine of bath, books, bottle, and bouncing felt manageable to us. And by the end of the fog of that first year, he seemed to settle nicely into a sleep routine of 8 p.m. bedtime, wake ups around midnight and 5, and awake at 8 a.m. Unfortunately, or fortunately, No two babies are alike, even if you have twins. Let's fast forward to our second son, Aaron, and we have a completely different story. He slept quite well for the first 6 months of life. We had him in his crib in his bedroom next door to ours by the end of the first week. He fed well and went to sleep easily, so we just continued on. But around 6 months old, his sleep quality seemed to diminish between moving cross country and dealing with many sicknesses and ear infections. His wake ups were becoming very random and very frequent. We heavily relied on the bottle and bouncing on the yoga ball to get him to fall asleep. This was taking a lot of energy because of the sporadic nature of not knowing what each night would look like. The idea of sleep training was not on our horizon for Zeke, but for Aaron, trying something different seemed more and more alluring. It had become very evident with the many random wake ups every night that Aaron had not developed any coping skills for falling back to sleep when he was placed in his crib. This desire to do something different led me to pick up a book. It's called Precious Little Sleep by Alexis Dubief. I absolutely loved the author's practical approach and the way she addressed many fears and concerns that people can have walking into sleep training. To quote the author, she says, many infant sleep philosophies focus on gentle methods, but gradual is a more accurate term. She then goes on to say, the term gentle also creates a dichotomy where everything else defaults to harsh, which is both unfair and inaccurate. A few tears don't mean that you're unloving or that you're doing the wrong thing. Tears mean you're frustrating your child, and that's absolutely okay. Part of your job is to give your child the space to muddle through hard things as they develop new skills. This is neither the first nor the last time your child will struggle to overcome a challenge. Let's stop right there and refer back to our point at hand. We will always do what makes sense to us. We can always explain our reasoning for our actions when we take a moment to think about what brought us to our conclusion. Did you see how the author addressed the potentially guilt ridden parent who is holding on to the idea that allowing their baby to cry is neglectful or bad? And how she gently reframed the concept of gentle sleep methods to see them as gradual, which pretty aptly described the approach we took with our eldest son, and it worked well for him. And then notice how she gives parents permission to let their kids struggle through the challenge. Because after all, they will have many challenges ahead of them in life. And this one doesn't have to be all that different. Now, I'm not sure that I felt a strong sense of guilt around the concept of letting our baby cry and be uncomfortable as he figured out how to fall asleep. In other areas of our days, I'm pretty on board with letting my kids fuss and feel their emotions. I'm also in tune with my own bouts of anger bubbling up, and I see the immense value in sitting them down and walking away from a hard situation. But along these lines, I can see where I've bought into this concept that I am the one my baby depends on to regulate his temperament. After all, who doesn't want a happy baby? While it's an admirable goal to have a blissful home with peace, we can acknowledge the reality that this is quite unattainable at all times. And we don't get to control or own how others feel ever. Again, my husband and I were feeling extremely worn down and at the point where we needed to try something different. This author made a solid case, and I changed my approach. Onward to sleep training we went. Aaron had a couple rough nights at bedtime. As I set him down awake in the crib, he did not like this bright idea of learning to fall asleep without the ritual bottle and bouncing session. My husband and I definitely felt for him, but we also bought into the idea of this approach being able to work and help us get beyond the sleep struggles we were dealing with. It's been a few weeks now, and baby Aaron has figured out how to fall asleep in his crib without help, both at bedtime and nap time. He may cry or fuss for a moment, or give us no fuss at all. This has alleviated the time we were spending on bedtime routine, and more importantly, his sleeping has improved overnight. We have had a couple nights of him sleeping fully through the night, and a couple nights of a wake up around midnight and a fall back asleep after feeding. There's also been some occasional bursts of cries within the first couple hours of him being set down, but they aren't lasting very long, and it seems he has figured out how to fall back asleep. I'm glad we did something different and this change worked for Aaron. And I'm also glad that the gradual method worked for us when we had our son Zeke. Now, if we have another kid someday, I'll save that nuanced conversation for the future. Let's move on to another situation that reveals our confirmation bias and how we justify our own decisions. What did you think of COVID? To start, let's acknowledge that COVID was a very hard time for everyone. Our lives were impacted greatly, and unfortunately, the polarizing opinions that often got the most publicity only led to further damaged relationships and assumptions. We all felt the stress from the sacrifices we made and the level of disruption we felt as we tried to find a new normal to settle into. We are changed, things are different. There's no doubt about that. Let's consider our confirmation bias. From the perspective of the one that chose not to get the jab and then survived a COVID infection, they just confirmed to themselves that their body beat the virus just fine and they didn't need the shot to begin with. And from the perspective of the person that received the vaccination and then survived a COVID infection, they concluded that they were grateful to have received the shot, or it could have gotten much worse for them. Each side made a calculated decision on what risks made sense to them and then reasoned with their outcome accordingly. Both sides have confirmed their own bias here. Now, this winter season has brought a lot of sickness with it. There have been a lot of cases of flu and hospitalizations with RSV. And returning to the COVID perspectives, let's consider how this blustery winter of sickness can justify each opponent's stance. From the perspective of the one that thought social distancing was a wise approach to reduce the spread, this information has likely led them to conclude that COVID fatigue is causing people to be more lax on sanitizing and staying home if they feel sick at all. And this has led to the uptick in sickness. And from the other perspective of the person that saw greater damage from isolation and lockdowns, this has likely led them to conclude that the uptick in sickness is due to everyone not being gradually exposed to these germs and illness over the past couple of years. If you can detach yourself long enough from whichever side you more identify with, we can see that each side has made a reasonable argument and justified their conclusions accordingly. Do you see or feel anxious from the uncomfortable nuance presented from these opposing COVID perspectives? Both parties have tried to make sense of their world, and they've concluded something quite different. And then they've supported their reasoning with confirmation bias and justifications. Is one better or smarter than the other? I'm not so sure. I definitely have my own inclinations and blind spots, but I'd like to leave nuance here so that I can try to see the beauty that each person brings to the conversation. How about you? Before we dive into this week's episode, I thought I'd take a moment to explain the point of recommending a book every week. Over the past decade, I'd say, I have read many books that are mostly in the nonfiction realm, and I've really enjoyed them and I've grown a good bit. So, as we are looking to be nuanced in our perspectives and grow and understand what other people think on varied topics, I thought I would throw these in weekly so that if a topic is of interest to you, you might consider giving that book a read. But no pressure, you definitely don't need to read a book a week. And with that, let's dive into the book recommendation. It is The Power of Habit: Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business by Charles Duhigg. He takes a different angle for answering our question this week by digging into how we are creatures of habit. Those monotonous everyday tasks indeed play a hefty role in forming our behaviors and character by teaching us to pay attention to the habit loop, which he identifies as a cue that leads to us doing a routine, which then leads to us seeing a reward. Over time, this rhythm of cue, routine, reward becomes automatic, thus creating a habit. He challenges us to see that habits can be changed when we are aware of these parts by essentially fiddling with the gears. He also gives some witty examples of how advertisers and marketing teams have capitalized on influencing our perspectives with cravings and telling us what we should consider the reward. See Chapter 2 and enjoy the retelling of how Pepsodent toothpaste became a household staple. The author goes on to explain that we can never truly extinguish our bad habits, but we can insert new routines between the old cue and familiar reward that's already in place. Now, I enjoyed this book because it made me stop and take inventory on some of the habits that I have. In particular, while I was reading this, I realized being at home all day placed me in the kitchen more often. The kitchen was a cue for me that led me to dig into the pantry and partake in unnecessary added calories every day. Now, I can't altogether avoid the kitchen, but I can try to drink a glass of water when I eye up the pantry and wait 5 minutes to see if I'm actually hungry or just eating out of habit. I also really enjoyed one of the final stories in the closing chapter on free will. It was a story about a mom who began visiting a casino once her children were all school aged. He paints a fascinating picture on how her boundaries and habits changed over this time period. At first, she had clear rules in place that led her to win at the casino. And as she began winning, the casino took notice and started to provide her greater rewards and prestige. Her rules gradually became more flexible, and the casino provided her a line of credit, so she became less aware of her winnings and losses as she regularly came in to gamble. but the casino was acutely aware of every trip. The incentives to stick around and enjoy the luxuries the casino provided led her to head in every day by the following year, and she eventually lost big, and her family went into bankruptcy. The author poses an interesting thought here about free will and habits, that her gambling had become a habit and was potentially not a choice anymore. How much responsibility should she bear, and what would you have done if you were in her shoes? It's interesting to consider how we can get so carried away in our day to day activities that we don't stop to realize exactly what we're doing. Thanks for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you consider leaving me a review or possibly share it with a friend? And if you would like to get in touch, you can send me an email at nuancedbeauty@yahoo.com. Take care until next time.